Hey everybody, so I've got that really wonderful map of Mexican Texas up. I didn't post a URL of that. I'm going to do that after I do this little podcast. And what I'm going to talk about in this podcast is the fight in Saltillo over whether or not um, Texas, the which was a unit of a larger state called Coahuila y Tejas, whether or not it would have slavery. As I've said many times, and I guess you probably learned it by now, the Constitution of 1824 kicked the issue of slavery to the local states. And no other portion of Mexico cared about slavery or wanted slavery except Texas for reasons that I've talked about. Austin's coming in, other colonists are coming in. They want slavery in Texas because they want to grow cotton. And also you have powerful interest, Tejano interest, and also Mexican interest in Saltillo that support the introduction of slavery into Texas because they want Texas to become part of the global cotton economy as well. But I can't say it enough. They want Texas to be part of the global cotton economy as a Mexican state, not as an independent country or as part of the United States. Okay, so really, what it comes down to is money, the importance of cotton, and of course, cotton production is intimately, inexorably tied up with slavery, the evil system of labor that enmeshed by 1860 in the United States, 4 million African Americans, and in Texas, just under 200,000. Okay, so a couple of points. The legislature in Coahuila was pretty small. I think it was only 12 or something, but there was only one delegate from Texas. So one of the things that I want you to get across to you is that Texas doesn't have a lot of say in the state legislature. And there's really no reason why it should. Texas still has a pretty small population. Even by 1836, there's about 35 or 36,000 Texans only. So Texas doesn't have a big population, but what the Texans have, the Anglo-Texans, and they're of course Tejano Texans too. Although by 1830 or so, the Tejanos are far outnumbered in Texas than by the Anglos. And that's something you should keep in mind, that very, very quickly, there's more Anglos in Texas than there are Tejanos, a legacy of the Spanish inability to populate Texas. I think in a podcast I said I was never going to say that again, and I snuck it in one more time. But it is important. It's really fundamental in understanding Texas history. There's more slaves in Texas than there are Tejanos by the 1830s as well. So pretty extraordinary. So Texas is a junior partner, but the Anglos in Texas that want to introduce slavery have powerful supporters, both in Saltillo and in San Antonio as well, among the Tejano elite. And what I'm going to talk about today is in this podcast rather, is Article 13 of the the state constitution of Coahuila y Tejas. Okay, again, Article 13, kind of thing that drives you crazy about Texas history or history in general. It's so detailed. You might remember it because 13 is an unlucky number. And for the slaves that were enmeshed in the system, it was very unlucky. But anyway, there's a big debate in Saltillo about the future of slavery in Texas. And what you had in Coahuila were, in Saltillo, particularly the state capital, there were a number of members of the state Congress who were writing the state constitution. So what happened was the federal constitution was written, and then the states wrote their own constitution. There were a number of people, probably a majority in Saltillo, who were anti-slavery. As I talked about in the previous podcast, Mexico took pride in the fact that there was almost no slavery in the new nation. And the only slavery that really existed was in its northeast, was in Mexican Texas. So the way to think about it is most Mexicans took a principled stand against slavery. And so there's a debate around the mid 1820s or so about the new constitution in Saltillo for Coahuila, Tejas. And Article 13 originally says this state prohibits absolutely and for all time slavery in all its territory, and slaves that already reside in the state will be free from the day of publication of the Constitution of this capital, from the day of the publication of the Constitution in this capital. So basically, initially, the anti-slavery forces in Saltillo got the upper hand, and they introduced in the discussion about the new Constitution for Coahuila, Tejas, an amendment that ended slavery. And it's kind of ironic, or it's a coincidence, because it's the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution that also ends slavery as well. Just a coincidence, but kind of an interesting coincidence. And that's going to be, 4 decades later, and in the U.S., 700,000 people were killed before we got there. So I guess the parallel only goes to the number of the articles. So big debate in Coahuila. Stephen F. Austin goes nuts when he sees this amendment, or he sees this proposal for the Constitution. For Stephen F. Austin, if there's not going to be slavery in Texas, there's not going to be settlers in Texas. Americans will not come into Texas without their slaves, because most Americans that were coming in from Texas, in large part because of just the geography of Texas, right? Texas, think about the neighbors of Texas. Who neighbors Texas? Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas is neighbored by slave states. And the majority of the Anglos that had come into Texas were very much part of slave society and very much supported slave society. So geography plays a role in this. So settlers were reluctant to come into Texas because even though the land was much cheaper in Texas than it was in the United States, Mexican Texas, US settlers were afraid to bring in their slaves because they felt like the Mexican government would not protect them to the extent that the US government protected slavery. And there were ironclad protections for slavery in the United States. So for Austin, he sees this proposal, and it's just a proposal at this time, and this for him is a disaster. And in telling the story, I'm not trying to be sympathetic to Austin. I'm just explaining where he's coming from, okay? He's a more complicated figure than many of the stories that are told about him. He's an interesting person. And so he wants Texas to work in Mexico, but as a slave state within the Mexican Republic. So when he sees Article 13, he is very, very concerned. And he starts beginning to lobby the legislature in Saltillo. He works with Tejanos in San Antonio, including Saucedo, who is the Mexican governor in San Antonio. So again, Tejano elites, the powerful folks in Texas of Tejano descent, they, for the most part, are totally pro-slavery because they want cotton in Texas because they want to become wealthy, okay? So almost instantly, Austin begins working with his Tejano allies to amend Article 13 to see if he can undermine it or change it. And so even though there's only one delegate in the Saltillo legislature from Texas, Austin does have some support, both from Tejanos within Texas, but also from some of the folks in Saltillo who also are supportive of slavery being introduced into Texas because they feel like they can get a cut of the cotton dollar because Texas is nearby. So what happens is that a concerted effort begins among Tejanos, among Anglos such as Stephen F. Austin, among some of the leaders in Saltillo, especially the Vasquea brothers, and I'm going to write that down in the in the little outline under this podcast. Also, this is what Torget talks about as well. They begin lobbying in Saltillo to amend this proposed Article 13 that would end slavery almost instantly. So what happens is that what they do is they start this fight, and very slowly they start to chip away at the absolute abolition of slavery that the first iteration of Article 13 of the state constitution in Saltillo discusses. In its first iteration, slavery is just going to be ended in Texas and in the Northeast. And Austin, working with his Tejano allies and some of the leading figures in Saltillo, they start chipping away at this proposal. And I'll talk about that process in the next podcast.